Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Respected friends and Professor Hussein Yilmaz and members of the Abu Sulaiman Center for Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, Dr. Hisham Talib and friends as well as colleagues from George Mason University. Thank you very much for welcoming me here today. It is indeed an honor to be here. I've stayed in Virginia before. I was in Georgetown University from 2017 to 2018, and I passed by the campus, but I never stopped by right in the campus. Such a beautiful place. It is indeed really an opportune moment to speak on the behalf of this center, and I'm very, very glad that it is called the Anwar Ibrahim Lectures for a few reasons. One is autobiographical, and the other is actually intellectual. Of course, the third thing, if anybody knows Anwar, he will say, Khairudin, you should add polemical as well. So there are polemical reasons why we should talk about Anwar Ibrahim today. The autobiographical part is interesting because I was born in 1976, growing up in Singapore, very much close to Malaysia. And in that kind of age, we were observing what was happening in Malaysia. Anwar Ibrahim, as you know, is so much embedded in the history of Malaysia that us who are growing up in Singapore, we tend to look up to him as sources of inspiration. So my relationship with Anwar, if I can say it, almost openly, has always been as a student who was very much inspired by the kind of energy that he had and the kind of vision that he always established for the rest of us. He always sets a high standard for everyone. And that leads me to the second reason why we should talk about Anwar Ibrahim and why this lecture should be named after him, is the intellectual horizons that Anwar Ibrahim has introduced to us in Southeast Asia. At the heart of Anwar Ibrahim's mainstay in his thought is the whole idea of reform. And when we talk about reform, we are talking about the two big concepts in Islam, tajdeed and islah. And this is something that I'm going to talk about today. Now, the third reason is a polemical one. Why is it polemical? Because whenever the name Anwar Ibrahim is mentioned, you are either his friend or you are his enemy. And this is always an issue. I know Dr. Hisham for a long time, and we talk about this. Anwar Ibrahim is at once a unifying figure, but on the other hand, he is a figure very much feared by people who are not able to accept the depth and the breadth of his ideas. And that's why he is worth engaging with. So I want to talk today about this current book that's just been published. Alhamdulillah, my wife messaged me just now and said that, the book has already been published. I thought it's going to be out next year, but it's already here. And the title of my presentation today is The Islamic Reformist Mosaic in Southeast Asia. I will explain what this actually means. I'm going to begin by talking about how we should reposition Southeast Asian Islam in global history. Part of the discussion about repositioning of Islam in Southeast Asian history will be covered by Ismail Alatas. He will talk about why this whole idea of Southeast Asian Islam as the periphery in comparison to the core, which is the Arab world, ought to be problematized. And then I'm going to talk about the problems of Muslim thought, how Muslim thought has been categorized. So I'm going to talk about categorizations, the problematics of categorizations, why certain categories that we have used to understand Islam, especially Islamic thought, has become so problematic that we need to rethink a lot of these categories. And I will offer some ways out. And one of the categories that I am trying to introduce in this book is called the Islamic Reformist Mosaic, a new way of understanding Islamic reform, of Islah and Tajdeed. And then there's 7 strands of thought that I talked about in the book, but because of the limitations of time, I'll just cover 3 of them. 3 major thinkers in Southeast Asia, one of which has a name Alatas as well, who has shaped the terrain of reformist thought in Southeast Asia. So let us begin first with Mr. Anwar Ibrahim. Whenever we talk about Anwar Ibrahim, we must go back to that one book that defined basically his entire career. The title of the book is The Asian Renaissance. And in his book, Anwar Ibrahim mentioned that the wave of Islamic revivalism that began with the anti-imperialist struggles of the previous century has gained further momentum in our times. This was in the 1990s, at the height of Islamic revivalism in Southeast Asia, especially among Muslims in Southeast Asia. Now, instead of going towards more parochial ideas, Anwar Ibrahim said then that we need to reassert the universalism of Islam, its values of justice, compassion, and tolerance in a world that is yearning for a sense of direction and for genuine peace. If this could be achieved, Muslims can truly contribute to the shaping of a new world. Again, I was just an undergrad when I was reading this, and it was like boom, right? Here is this man who is known to be a student activist. He was from ABIM, as mentioned by Dr. Hisham just now. People were thinking that he was trying to bring Muslims towards more provincialized way of thinking. But Anwar was going on the opposite direction. He was telling all Muslims during that time that we need to open up, we need to engage, we need to be more cosmopolitan, we need to be more plural, we need to be more universal. And this particular quote became a kind of mobilizing ideology for me in the years to come. And I'm going to talk about it. Here I'm going to enter a little bit into autobiographical kind of reflections on my own work in relation to Anwar Ibrahim. But we need to begin again by repositioning Southeast Asian Islam in global history. Now, if you look at the map of the Muslim world, what we have here is a problem of disproportionality, or the question of disproportionality. The number of Muslims in the Middle East, or the MENA region, is only 370 million. The number of Muslims in the sub-Saharan African region is only 248 million people. And the bulk of Muslims that we find in the world today are actually in the Asia Pacific, of which 1/3 of it are found in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, the country that my ancestors and also the ancestors of Ismail Alatas are from, is the largest and the most populous Muslim country in the world today. But whenever we talk about Islam, Southeast Asia is always at the periphery in most discussions of Muslim thought. And this problem or disproportionality is something that we need to fix within Islamic studies, and we need to fix by first questioning the kind of mindsets that we have towards Islam as a religion, as a global religion, and the whole idea there is only one center of Islam. Because the whole assumption that there is one center where everything emanates problematizes the whole idea that there were many other different sub-centers that equally contributed to the making of Islam as a global religion. There are two works that are trying to challenge this whole idea that Southeast Asian Islam has very little to contribute in terms of the making of global Islam. One of which is very much known to Dr. Hisham Talib. He's a very familiar name, Osman Bakar, who's a very good friend of Anwar Ibrahim himself, who wrote the book Islamic Civilization and the Modern World, talking about how the Islamic civilization ought to be recast and reformulated to include other regions of what Richard Bulliet has called the view from the age, to look at Islam from the ages as the center. And of course, the book by Anthony Milner, The Malays, talking about how the Malays had contributed also to different kinds of ideas about Islam, about Muslim societies. And in my own way, I also have tried to, in a sense, challenge this whole idea of the peripheralization of Islam in Southeast Asia. This book that was mentioned just now by Dr. Hussein, Muslim Cosmopolitanism, was actually, it germinated from the discussion that I had in IIIT in 2014. So I was here in Columbia University, and we had this seminar at IIIT. Dr. Hisham was there, and he was criticizing basically the idea that I had then. But from then came out this book, Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspective, where I argued that if you want to see Islam that is of cosmopolitan in character, you must come to Southeast Asia to look at it. And this cosmopolitanism that is there in Southeast Asia is there in the larger Muslim world. Southeast Asia provides us with a basis of comparison, with a way to look how the universal and the peculiar is also there in Southeast Asia itself. My other book, Islam in Malaysia, tries to show that the history of Islam in the world, and especially in Malaysia, would not have been possible without the agency of non-Muslims. So when I presented it in Georgetown University in 2017, it was a controversial thing because I'm making the argument that Islam wouldn't have spread without non-Muslims helping Muslims in purveying the religion in Southeast Asia. And indeed, that's always been the case when we look at Islamic history. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wouldn't have done his mission well enough if not for the help of Abu Talib, of many non-Muslims who contributed to the making of Islam. Dr. Hisham also challenged me during that session on Muslim cosmopolitanism. Can you show to me one scholar in Southeast Asia that is of equal standing to some of the scholars in the Middle East? So I wrote this book, Hamka and Islam, a big scholar who wrote 118 books in his lifetime, who in himself shows a kind of thinking that is very cosmopolitan in nature, but his cosmopolitanism is directed towards reforming the Malay world. And in the latest book that I published with a group of scholars, of 23 other scholars, we all argued that Southeast Asian Islam is far from peripheral in the wider terrain of global Islam. Rather, studying Islam in Southeast Asia could provide us with windows to understanding how one of the fastest growing religions has embedded itself deeply in local societies while exhibiting universality, inclusivity, and shared features of Islamic expressions and manifestations found elsewhere. So I want to begin with this high note that we in Southeast Asia, even though it takes me about 36 hours to get here and losing my luggage bag along the way, have a lot to contribute to the world of Islam. This peripheralization of Islam in Southeast Asia has done injustice to Islamic studies, to the studies of Islamic thought. And what me, myself, as well as Ismail are trying to do here is to try to reposition it again and to make the argument that there is a need for us to factor in Southeast Asia, to factor in someone like Anwar Ibrahim as someone who has contributed not only to Malaysia, not only to Southeast Asia, but also to the world of Islam. Now that leads me to the second part of my presentation, which is the whole idea of categorizations. One of the reasons why Southeast Asian Islam has been viewed as a periphery has to do with the kind of categories that we have been using in the study of Islam as a whole. Now, a lot of studies on Islam has been structured around dichotomies and binaries. We have the problem of either ors or left and right. So whenever we study Muslim thinkers, it is either that Muslim thinker is modern or traditional, or it's progressive or conservative. So if Dr. Hisham starts his lecture giving salutations of peace to Prophet Muhammad, then he must be very conservative, right? Or if someone comes in and just wear a t-shirt and gives a lecture on Islam, he must be very, very progressive. Or it's either that person is a pacifist or a radical, depending on who he or she supports, or whether that person is a fundamentalist or secularist. We are all too familiar with these categories in Islamic studies. And these categories, to me, have, in a sense, clouded or obscure the manner to which we view Islam as a whole. In the book by Clinton Bennett, Muslims and Modernity, Current Debates, this continuum has become something that is taken for granted. You're either a progressive, a neo-traditionalist, a traditionalist, or a radical revisionist. You cannot be all of them. But when you talk to Muslim thinkers, such as Anwar Ibrahim, on some issues, he's very progressive. On other issues, he's quite traditionalist. And on many issues, he's a revisionist. These categories, the way I see it, as another scholar who's an Orientalist, but has written a powerful book called Muslims as Actors, he says that these terms do not render any services to a serious study of a variety of social radiation and interaction, or to any understanding of interests, motivations, and intentions guiding the adherents of Islam. And we need to rethink all of these categories. And one category that I totally dislike is the category Islamists. I'm so sorry that I have to say here today, because even Muslims are appropriating this term now, Islamiyun, which to me, even though it is used by Rashid Ghanouchi to describe his movement, has become a term that has been used in ways that makes the whole understanding of Islam very, very problematic. So I'm just going to put it out there so that it can become a matter of discussion as we go to the question and answer session. But what I'm trying to offer in this book that has just been published is that we need to look at Islamic Reformism in a totally new way. Now, Dr. Hisham mentioned how Islam is very much linked to aesthetics. We cannot study Islamic politics without looking at Islamic ethics, without connecting it to Islamic aesthetics. All three are integrated to one another, and what I have done in this book is to draw from Islamic art to reconceptualize and understand Islamic thought. I am saying in this book, Shapers of Islam, in Southeast Asia, that just been published, that we need to now redefine what being an Islamic reformist is. And I'm saying in the book, when we talk about Islamic reformism, we cannot divorce it from the fact that there is a genealogy of thought, of what has been called the Turath, or the silsila of thinking. That when we talk about Islamic reformism, we need to take into account a long and unbroken line of Fiqh scholarship that derive its inspiration from two foundational sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is where, whenever we study Islamic thought today, there is an attempt to somehow decouple Islamic thought from the Quran and Sunnah. And from my own formulation, if someone says that he or she is an Islamic reformist, and he says we don't need to look at the Quran or we don't need to look at the Sunnah, that's not Islamic reformism. And because Islamic thought is genealogical, its primary intent is to reform, islah, and renew the Muslim way of thought. So that's the first. The Islamic thought must have something that comes before it, and before it, and before it. It's genealogical. The second is that it is dialogical. And this is a topic that I'm picking it up from my current book on Sufism, that Sufism is a dialogical tradition, that whenever we look at Islamic thought, it is a style of thought that rethinks commonly held ideas about Islam as both a belief system and a lived reality. This necessitates dynamic interactions between text and context to offer innovative solutions to problems confronting society. That whenever we look at Islamic thought, it is always in dialogue with other ways of thinking. That Muslims were always engaging with other Muslims, that's one. Muslims were always engaging with non-Muslim systems of thought. Think of Al-Ghazali, who was very much influenced by Greek thought, and then fused it to come out with his great book, Ihya Ulumuddin. Think of so many other scholars, Ibn Rushd and others. And then we think of Anwar Ibrahim as a case in point, whom in his own Asian Renaissance says that we cannot reform Muslim societies if we are not in dialogue with non-Muslims in the ways in which they think about their societies. It is only, and this is where I want to draw from this German philosopher whose name is Hans-Georg Gadamer, who says that it is only when we have a fusion of horizons that a new way of thinking can be developed. In my book, I argue that Southeast Asian thinkers already had this in their tradition. And why do I use the word mosaic? I would like to encourage the students who are here today to read this very interesting conversation between Sulaiman Murad and Perry Anderson, The Mosaic of Islam. It's a beautiful book. Basically, it's an interview about what Sulaiman Murad thinks about Islam and Perry Anderson's own idea of Islam. The word mosaic represents the strands of reformist thinking in Southeast Asia, each drawing the ideas from one another, but all of them form a unified and coherent frame. I take this from art, trying to show that even though Muslim thinkers may have different ideas about Islam, they are all within that tradition that is trying to reform Islam as a whole. Why we need to use the word mosaic? Because it captures the reality that Islamic reformism in Southeast Asia was scarcely divorced from society at large, much like the pieces of decorative materials that are permanently affixed and eventually become part of a given surface. Muslim intellectuals were initially seen as outsiders and outliers. And again, we go back to Anwar Ibrahim, who began and was seen and categorized as a radical Islamist. He eventually emerged as the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, and then fell from grace to be a criminal, and now he's back again to bring out new ideas about Islam in Southeast Asia. And I'm saying when we look at it from this mosaic perspective, what we see is basically different people coming together, forming this whole unified frame called the Islamic Reformist Mosaic. So there are 7 strands of thought that I looked at in my book. The first is by Naguib Alatas. The second is Harun Nasution, an Indonesian thinker who is a rationalist. Naguib Alatas is a de-secularist. Osman Bakar, the epistemologist. Ahmad Ibrahim, the legalist. Konto Wijoyo, who talks about history. Siza Adib Majul, who he died here in California. He was from the Philippines, who believe in the integration between Muslims and non-Muslims. And last but not least, this very exciting thinker, Zakia Darajat, who was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, whom I term as a moralist. So just to finish off my presentation, I just want to look at these 3 thinkers, just to give you a flavor of what this book is all about. Now I want to begin with this very interesting lady, who was a professor of psychology at the Sharif Hidayatullah State Islamic University, who was the first woman in the history of Indonesia to be part of the Majlis Ulama Indonesia. Not only that, she was the first Indonesian woman to get a PhD from Cairo University in psychology, what was known then as Ilm al-Nufus, right? In Ilmu al-Nafs. And she came out with this whole idea of religious-oriented psychology. Now, what's interesting about Zakia Darajat is that she is saying, and this is between the 1960s to the 2000s, that we need to integrate the Muslim psycho-spiritual tradition with modern psychology. A project that was picked up by another scholar named Professor Malik Badri, who wrote an amazing book about the crisis of Muslim psychologists, published by IIIT. And similarly, Zakia Darajat said that we need to apply Islamic ideas about the soul, desires, and akhlaq with up-to-date theories of human behavior and policies of contemporary states. Now, she becomes a representative of this Islamic Reformist Mosaic because not only did she drew from Islamic ideas, she drew a lot from Western ideas, fused them together to come up with this new idea of a religious-oriented psychology. A lot of what Zakia Darajat has discussed during her time, this book was published in the 1970s, are now picked up by mainstream scholars looking at religion and mental health. So Harold Koenig is one of the leading scholars who's now arguing for the fact that religion does play a role in the mental health of human beings. So what I want to show here by making this comparison is to show that a lot of what Southeast Asian thinkers had talked about many, many decades ago has now become mainstream in the West. But the West are not looking at Southeast Asia for some of these exemplars that were there, right? So Zakia Darajat is one of them, and she says in her book, moral values are fixed and unchanging regardless of any situation, place, or time, are those that trace their origins from religion. Permanent and absolute moral values that trace their origins from religion bring serenity to the soul, because the soul has a compass everywhere it goes. It becomes certain and not easily swayed. The second thinker that I just want to quickly look at is this man, Najib Alatas, of course, the namesake of our professor here, Ismail Alatas. I think he's his uncle on another strand of the Hadrami diaspora. He was the founder and the first Al-Ghazali Chair of Islamic Thought at the International Institute of Islamic Civilization and the Malay World, ISTAC. And he talks about the deformations of secularism. Now, Naguib Alatas, I term him as a de-secularist because in the 1970s, at the same time as Zakia Darajat, he was arguing for a movement out of secularism, what is now called as moving towards a post-secularist world. And he criticizes the whole idea of Western secularism determining the values of Muslims in Southeast Asia. And part of this criticism came the Islamization of Knowledge project. Now, I am personally a critic of this project myself, right? And I grew up with this project, and I feel that it has run out of steam and it needs to be reformed in one way or another. But in its time, the project did a lot of good work in trying to criticize Western systems of thought and how Western values have been infused into Islamic societies. And he talks about how we need to infuse Islamic values to undo agnostic and atheistic systems of thought. Naqib al-Atas is interesting because when he was writing his work, there were also debates in the Western world about this whole idea of the desecularization of knowledge. Naqib al-Atas is another man who, again, even though he talks about the Islamization of knowledge, a lot of his ideas were actually drawn from Christian theologians. So if you read his book, Islam and Secularism, he says, I venture to maintain that the greatest challenge that has serendipitously arisen in our age is the challenge of knowledge as conceived and disseminated throughout the world by Western civilization, knowledge whose nature has become problematic because it has lost its true purpose due to being unjustly conceived and has thus brought chaos in man's life instead of and rather peace and justice, knowledge that pretends to be real but which is productive of confusion and skepticism, which has elevated doubt and conjecture to the scientific rank in methodology, knowledge which has, for the first time in history, brought chaos to the three kingdoms of nature, the animal, the vegetal, and the mineral. Very, very long sentences, and he's known to be this very verbose writer, but his point is clearly made that by fusing Western critiques of secularism with that of Islamic conceptions of knowledge, we can then bring Muslims to a new way of looking at knowledge that are grounded in Islamic values. I'm just going to skip the last slide because we are running out of time, but I want to conclude by saying that we need to now reposition Islamic thought in the study of Islam, Islamic thought in Southeast Asia, in the study of Islam globally. We need to bring in new categories that can help us to understand Islamic thought in a wholly new way. We need to move beyond the ways in which Islam has been studied by both Muslim and Western scholars, and the way to do it is to dig deep in traditions that have been ignored, be it from Africa, be it from Central Asia, or more so from Southeast Asia. There is this whole Islamic Reformist Mosaic that is there, and we need to pay attention to it, and we need to revive a lot of these ideas that are there. Thank you very much. Aqulu qawli hadha wa astaghfirullahal azim li wa lakum. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.